Number 3, you are not your past. Number 4, you are not what you did or even what you do. Number 5, you are not the label that others gave you, or maybe you even gave yourself. Maybe you're still giving yourself that label today. And number 6, the most important one, you and I are who God says we are. You and I are who God says we are. Now, you may look at the screen and you may think, okay, somebody missed it. There was a typo this week, or our spell check didn't work. That's not the case. That is the title of the lesson. We're focusing on alter ego. And that's the reason for this altar. Now, before I get all kinds of emails and texts this week, for all kinds of reasons, this is not a permanent fixture. It's for the purpose of our lesson this morning. I'll probably get emails from some of you who will say, I wish it was a permanent fixture. But either way, it's not a permanent fixture. This morning, I want us to really focus on laying our egos on the altar, metaphorically speaking, on the altar of God. On the altar of God's love, on the altar of God's grace, on the altar of God's mercy, on the altar of God's strength, on the altar of God's power this morning. Now, likely we're familiar with the word ego, and we could say a lot about that, but I just want to briefly say ego is that voice inside of us that says who we think we are, or who we think we believe we are. And I would say right off the bat that some of us just think too highly of ourselves. I can fit that category. And some of us think too lowly of ourselves. And sometimes I can fit that category as well. And there may be a room full of people that fit that category this morning more than the other one. And we're familiar with the word altar, A-L-T-A-R. Altar is a place of worship. It's a place where people would come to bring their sacrifices, to bring their offerings to God. Hence, on the screen, altar, ego. Here, altar, ego. I want us to be thinking about this morning, bringing our ego before God and laying it on the altar and truly seeing ourselves the way God sees us. Not the way we see ourselves, not the way others see us. This morning in our worship, we want to sacrifice. We bring sacrifices of praise, but we want to sacrifice our egos on the altar of God. What's on the screen is symbolic of that altar. What's here this morning is symbolic of that altar. God has His own altar. And there are really a number of different areas that probably impact the way we see ourselves. If I could give the microphone to everyone this morning, and some of you will stick your hands up, I'd like to have it. You would each probably say, here's what impacts the way I view me. But here are 4 things that I want to suggest to you, and really there's only one that we're going to talk about in detail this morning. These all impact our ego. Number 1, our feelings of inadequacy. That's the one we're going to zero in on this morning. Or our need for control in our lives. Or 3, our right, and I'll put that in quotes, our right to be offended. And then 4, our longing for approval. In each of these areas, all 4 of those that I just shared, we can have distorted views of ourselves. We can have distorted egos. All of these impact a healthy ego one way or the other. They impact the way we view ourselves. They impact the way we view the Bible sees us, and they impact the way we view that God sees us. But this morning, we're going to be examining that one that I mentioned, and that is our feelings of inadequacy. But before I jump into those, I think it's worthwhile, maybe for a later lesson down the road, whether it's me, Mark, one of our elders, to talk about the others. But I want to briefly share with you just a few things about each one of those others and how they impact the way we view ourselves. Number 1, our need for control. Some of us, I think, are more overcome by this than others in this particular area. But I think all of us, we could say probably from Adam forward, we've been plagued with this particular thing by Satan. Because we wrestle with trying to control our lives. We wrestle with trying to control our circumstances, with trying to control our environment, and even more personally, trying to control those people who are in our world. We want to control. And that need for control needs to be laid on the altar of God this morning. When you get a chance, look in Proverbs 3, 5 through 6. We'll not have that on the screen and look at it this morning, but the thrust of that is this. Solomon says, trust in the Lord. Don't trust in your control. Trust in His control. Trust in the Lord. So our need for control can impact that. Number 2, our right to be offended. I hope that kind of strikes you funny. Right, we don't have any right to be offended. I agree with you on that. The Lord would agree with you on that. But in reality, we assert that right quite often. In a world of entitlement and in a world of it's all about me most of the time, I think we often feel this kind of inalienable right that says, I have a right to be offended. And very often we enjoy that feeling. And we assert ourselves and we say, you've hurt me. And here we go. We've got to lay that on the altar of God. We have no such right. Paul said, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Not I, but who? Christ lives in me. In Romans 12:3, Paul also says, he wrote to the Romans, he says, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought. We don't have that right. Then the third one is our longing for approval. Some of us, I think, stronger than others, but probably all of us, to one degree or another, long for approval from others. And it can be a driving force in our lives that causes us to see ourselves in a way that's very unhealthy. And not in a godlike kind of way. And that force shapes our feelings, it shapes our thoughts, it shapes our decisions, it shapes our actions in a powerful way. And I think we come by it quite often very naturally from our family of origin and our background. But it causes us to see our circumstances in a different kind of way. And it causes us to see our God in a different kind of way. And like that need for control, like that right to be offended, our longing for approval needs to be laid on the altar of God. Once again, Solomon in Proverbs 29:25 says this, fear of a man, let me rephrase that, striving for approval from others will prove to be a snare. But whoever trusts in the Lord will be kept safe. Now let's zero in on the one that I want us to talk about this morning briefly, and that's laying our feelings of inadequacy on the altar of God as well. Why do we feel inadequate? Well, once again, I could pass the microphone around, and all of us would probably share. This is why I feel inadequate at times. This is what I struggle with. But I want to share briefly just a few things with you that I think will impact that idea of why we feel inadequate. Number one, we have received unfair criticism in our lives. People have told us who they think we are. Whether that could be parents, that could be friends, that could be other significant individuals in our lives, but they've told us who they think they are. And what they've done is they've shared some labels with us, and we've come to believe those enemy messages from Satan through other people that shape how we view ourselves. Maybe people have told you in your life, you're stupid. You're too fat. You're too skinny. You're too tall. You're too short. You'll never succeed. You can't do well in school. You're hopeless. You're helpless. You're ugly. And you're just a failure. Those old messages from Satan through others, those enemy messages on the outside actually take shape in the inner me, the inner you, and they cause us to see ourselves in a way that is not healthy, and it's not the way God wants us to be seen. So the first one is we have received unfair criticism. But the second reason why we feel inadequate is this. We've received unrealistic compliments as well. People have told us at times, you're the greatest. You're the best. You can't ever do anything wrong. You are just super. I don't know a more perfect person than you. Already you're kind of, whoo. Head is swelling. You're getting excited about that. And while on the one hand that may seem very, very healthy and very, very helpful, in fact, it often harms us. It often does just the reverse. I think to each one of us, but in particular, what I've discovered, and I'm not trying to pick on this particular generation, but I've noticed in some of the younger generations, particularly the emergent generation that you hear us talk a lot about, that generation has grown up in a period where there was a lot of praise and approval heaped on them in a very powerful way. And a lot of significant adults in their lives have said, oh, you're the best. You're the greatest. And while we all enjoy that kind of praise, it can distort our views of ourselves. I remember back in the day when I was growing up, if Mark were here, he would say that would be back with Abraham. But when I was growing up, you actually had to win something to get a trophy. Really. I mean, nowadays, and it can, on the one hand, it can be great, we think in one sense, but nowadays, you just have to show up to get a trophy. It used to be that you would graduate from high school. Now you graduate from preschool, kindergarten, middle school, high school. Wow, that's like too much. Well, the question here is, as it shapes our feelings about ourselves and those expectations that we have of ourselves and that others place on us, what's that doing to us when we're getting that kind of unrealistic view of us, just as much as the other one, in terms of unfair criticism, is unrealistic as well? Because here's what happens. Others may say, oh, you're the greatest, you're the best, you're whatever. But in terms of me on the inside, maybe this is true of you, I can look at me and I can say, in a pretty objective way, no, that's not right. I'm not the greatest. I'm not the best. And if you only knew the real Rick, Dad, Mom, whomever, you wouldn't say that about me. So unfair criticism can impact that. Unrealistic compliments, but there's a third one as well. We've received unwise comparisons. Others have compared us to our siblings or to themselves or to standards that are beyond our reach because we're just different people than those to whom we are being compared. People have said, you need to be like so-and-so. Or worse than that, they've said, guess what? You're never going to be like so-and-so. You're never going to measure up. Well, those are just a few of the reasons, and we could all share our own if we had time, of why we feel so insignificant at times and how that can impact our relationship with our God and with one another. The ego, remember, tells us who we are not, when God wants to tell us who we are. Remember what I said earlier, you are not yet who you are supposed to be. We're always moving, always growing. You're not yet who you're supposed to be. Now, what I want us to do for the remaining time this morning is look briefly at a case study. A person out of the Old Testament, Gideon, and the passages in Judges 6, 11 through 18. And I'm going to read that, and it'll be on the screen as well. And after I read that, I want to comment on the passage just a little bit and then share 2 or 3 things with you about the particular text. Most of us are familiar with Gideon. We know that story, but if you're not, I think you will be as we read through it. And we're jumping in the middle of this. We're not reading the whole passage, but I want to share with you 11 and following. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak near Ophrah. She's a lot older than I thought she was. Okay, back to the passage. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak near Ophrah that belonged to Joash, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "But sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "But the Lord," Gideon asked, "how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and I will strike down all the Midianites together." Gideon replied, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." And the Lord said to him, "I will wait until you return." Now let's look at that passage just a little bit. Any of us who have any idea about threshing wheat And last week we didn't do it, but when we were with Cindy's brother for his birthday, his 60th birthday, it's a ranch there, and we talked some about the process there as he fed his cattle. And if you know anything about threshing wheat, you know that it's usually in a high, elevated area, and when you throw the wheat up, the wind blows it, and the chaff goes away, and the wheat drops down. Notice in your story, where is Gideon? Not in a high place, not in an open place. He is actually inside of a wine press, and he's cowering inside the wine press as he threshes his wheat because he's fearful and he's afraid. Now, what do you think Gideon thought about himself in that situation? What do you think others thought about him? Well, I'm not trying to be unkind to Gideon, but if I'd been there, probably due to my fallenness, I would have said, what a wuss. What a sissy. What's the deal? Get out there where you're supposed to thresh the wheat. What's the deal with you? It's a good thing I wasn't there and I'm not the one talking to Gideon, because I'd fit in the category of what I just described, someone who's trying to shape what Gideon thinks about himself. But I think Gideon felt that way. And look what God said to Gideon. The Lord is with you, and what did he call him? Mighty warrior. Mighty warrior. God, the Lord is with you. Now, listen to the enemy messages that come from Satan that are in Gideon's heart that become the inner me statements that he plays over and over and over. The Lord just said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior, and here comes Gideon. Sounds like me a lot. Well, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all of his wonders that our fathers told us about over and over and over again? Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us. And he's put all of this into our hands, meaning the Midianites, and we're in their control. Oh, can't you just see pity oozing out of him as he complains to God? But what did God say to Gideon after that response? He hangs in there with him, just like he'll hang in there with us. He says, go in the strength that you have, Gideon, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Well, Gideon gets on board here, right? No, look at his response. But Lord, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. I don't have anything. I don't amount to anything. I'm nobody. Boy, there are tribes like Judah and Levi, and I got Manasseh here, and I'm in this family that's really a nowhere family, not the best of the family. This is horrible, and I'm the runt of the litter. The Lord's still hanging in there with him. Because God's reassurance comes, and he says once again, I will be with you, and I will strike down all the Midianites together. Raise your hand if you feel like Gideon at times. I'm all alone here. We do. We do. Raise your hand if you complain a lot. Okay, more hands went up that time. Raise your hand if you need a message from the Lord today. We could even more hands on that deal. Okay. Well, I'm sitting in the room, really, with a bunch of mighty warriors. I promise you, you are mighty warriors facing your day with the Lord. Well, with that passage in mind, I want to talk about just three things that at least I draw out of this passage that I think are important, and they fit with the principles that I shared with you on the front end. Number one, God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God's view of you is different than your view of yourself. And God's view of you is different than others' view of you as well. God has put more in you than you realize. Look back in verse 12 at what the Lord said. The Lord is with you, and he called him what? Mighty. Say it again with me. Mighty warrior. Mighty warrior. Gideon sees himself one way. The other people see him one way. The Midianites, his enemies, see him one way. But the Lord, sees him as a mighty warrior. I think of other people throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. Names will probably pop in your mind besides Gideon as well. I think of Rahab at Jericho. All she saw as she looked in the mirror was a prostitute. All that others around her saw was a prostitute. But the Lord looked at her and said, I see more than a prostitute here. I see someone who by faith will help my people at Jericho. And not only will she help my people at Jericho, but by faith she will accept me as her God, and she will marry one of these Jewish leaders, and through Rahab will come David and ultimately Jesus Christ himself from a prostitute. Does God see more in people than we see in ourselves? Yes. I think of David himself. Most of the time with David, we look at him and we see a little boy who couldn't possibly do anything but kill a giant is a mighty warrior. We see someone who's known as an adulterer, but God saw a mighty warrior and a person that had a heart condition that we'd all like to have, a heart after God. I think of Peter, who denied the Lord and had a hard time facing that and looking at himself in the mirror. And the Lord said at the end of that, Peter, I don't see you that way. I see you as a mighty warrior. And then I think of Rick Fancher. As I said earlier, I've been on both ends of that spectrum of thinking I was the center of the universe to thinking I have nothing to offer. And the Lord said, guess what? I don't see you either way. I see you as my servant, and I see you as a broken vessel, and I'm going to use you in the way I choose to use you. So the first principle out of this that I want us to hold on to is God sees more in you than you see in yourself. The second is this: God has given you more than you think. God has given you more than you think. Remember, Gideon said, I don't have anything. I'm of the tribe of Manasseh. I'm just a runt in this thing. I got nothing to offer here. God says, no, I want you to go with what you have. I have given you more than you think. We constantly complain about what we do not have. And often we hear these negative enemy messages that translate to the inner messages inside of us. What I would say to you and to me this morning, and I say it to myself first, I've said it all week long, for weeks as we've looked at this lesson and as we've prayed about it. Don't you or I dare believe what someone else says about you. Don't do it. Don't do it. Good, bad, or indifferent, but especially the stuff that wants to tear you down from Satan, don't believe that. Don't you dare believe those negative inner me messages that come from the enemy on the outside. And don't you ever dare insult God by saying, I just don't have anything to bring to the altar this morning, and I'm not talking about money. Look at verse 14 and 6. Go in the strength you have, the Lord says, that I have given you. Am I not sending you? Peter, later on in his life, reflecting where he had grown and what he'd learned about these feelings of inadequacy by the power of the Spirit, he wrote in 2 Peter 1:3, His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of Him who has called us by His own glory and goodness. Did you hear what it said? His divine power has given us only a little. Is that what it said? Everything we need according to what? Life and godliness. We don't lack anything. We are mighty warriors. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God has given you more than you think. And then finally, and this is going to be a shocker, I'm glad you're sitting down for this one. It is less about you than you think. It is just less about you than you think. Gideon or Rick or Mark or Taylor or whoever we're talking about, any of us. Some of us think it's all about us. I've been there. Some of us think it has nothing to do with us, and I don't have anything to offer, like Gideon as well. But Gideon learned in this story it was less about him and more about God's power. And it's always about God's power. It's always about God's strength. It's always about God's presence and not ours. It's always more about the presence of God than it is my gifts, my talent, my skill, or my power. So remember, God sees more in you than you see in yourself. Number two, God has given you more than you think, and it's less about you than you think. Now I'm going to ask the Lord's Supper attendants, if they would, to move toward the back, because our whole worship and our whole lesson this morning has been moving toward setting up our time with the Lord, with the Son, and with the Spirit, and with one another in our communion. As I conclude, I want to suggest this to you. As you consider these principles, I encourage you to consider a lot of things this morning, remembering the principles, look at the passage, pray about it. But I'd like to suggest something very practical to you that's not original with me. It actually came from another place, but it's helpful to me. It was helpful to me as I prepared this lesson. Maybe it will be helpful to you as well. As you think about this lesson and as you think about stepping out each day into your world and into your life, into your calling of God, practice stepping out one forward. Just one step forward. And as you step forward, step out of your inadequacy and into your newness of life. Step forward and step out of your inadequacy into the presence of God. Step forward out of your inadequacy and into the grace of God, into the presence of God. Remember, if God calls you, He will always equip you. He will empower you. He will give you strength. He will be with you as He was with Gideon in a powerful way. He reminds us He will always be present with us. So this morning, I ask us, let's all sacrifice our egos on the altar of God this morning. Now, at the end of this section in verse 18, zero in on that for a moment. Gideon said, Lord, please don't leave right now because I've got something that I want to lay on the altar. I've got something that I want to bring. So I'm going to go away. And he did go away and he prepared a sacrifice. The Lord said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay right here. The Lord is with us this morning. And we bring a sacrifice this morning. We probably bring lots of sacrifices this morning. And I want us to think about sacrificing those feelings of inadequacy on the altar of God. Maybe the need for control. Anything else that you have in your life. And as you sacrifice that, think about those principles that we shared this morning. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God has given you more than you think. And really, it's just not all about you. Lay your ego, this is just an image. Lay your ego on the altar of God this morning. Lay your ego on the altar of God's power, God's grace, God's presence. But maybe there are some of you this morning that as we're doing communion, you want to write something down and you want to come and you want to lay it right on this altar. I think that would be fine as you take communion. But if you don't want to do that, you want to sit there, that will be fine as well. We don't have to put something here on the stage or on this altar to come before God and lay what we bring to Him as a sacrifice. And this morning, we're saying, sacrifice our egos on the altar. Because remember, we want to become not who we think we are or who others think or say we are, but we want to become who God says we are. So let's lay that false view of ourselves on the altar and let God give us that true view of ourselves. Mark Sanders is going to be leading us in prayer during the communion. I'm going to ask Mark if he would to move to the microphone. And once again, we're enjoying this time of communion. We're sharing with the Lord. We're remembering His death, His burial, and His resurrection. But like Gideon, we're stepping away to say, Lord, please don't leave. Don't leave. I've got a sacrifice to bring to you. You have that sacrifice in your hearts. Lay it on the altar this morning.